On the morning of April 20th, 1906, the line bent around the corner of Van Ness Avenue and Turk Street, moving slowly, as if all of San Francisco had been compressed into that short march of swollen feet and rolled blankets. Hands held crumpled papers, keys with no doors, singed photographs, small receipts, rent booklets saved at the last instant. Under a military tarp stretched by ropes, the kind the army put up when there was no time for anything, a mother had to carry out a task that was at once simple and impossible: to convince a stranger that she had been someone before the fire and that she was still someone after it. The name of her missing husband would not leave her mind, because it was the name that supported the weekly wage, the paid rent, the bread on the table, and also the name that, on ordinary days, was enough for a shopkeeper to write down a purchase on credit in a notebook. Without that name, everything came loose without support. With each step, the air brought the smell of wet ash, burned wood, and salted meat from the distributed rations, mixed with the rumor that payments would be cut off for anyone who could not prove residence and kinship, as if loss had to fit into stamps. And there was a reason that could not fit into words to remain there. Inside a single tent room in Golden Gate Park, her children were sleeping, 2 relatives who had come from Oakland, and 2 more strangers who had arrived the night before. If she came back empty-handed, there would be no coffee, no coal, no space for anyone else. Fuel, when it appeared, came measured out in small portions, and the coffee was thin, served in reused mugs. If she failed, she would have to choose who would be left out in the open. The city was still smoldering. The earthquake had occurred 2 days earlier, on Wednesday, April 18th, shortly after 5 in the morning, and what the shaking did not bring down, the fire devoured for 3 days, driven by the wind that came down from the hills and fed by leaks and debris. Where there had once been shop windows and streetcars, there were now heaps of brick and twisted iron, exposed rails, fallen wires, and the insistent sound of hammers trying to pry boards from the ruins to improvise shelters and passages. In the distance, the rise of Nob Hill appeared black as coal, with entire blocks reduced to isolated walls. When the sun cut through the smoke, everything took on a sickly yellow color. Soot settled on skin and tongue like fine dust, and it was impossible to forget that the air, too, had been struck. Ellen O'Rourke, 32 years old, narrow-shouldered and with laundress's hands, had grown up on a damp street in South of Market, near Folsom Street, and she knew the noise of factories, the leather smell of workshops, the steam and harsh soap of laundries, the cramped tenements where families shared thin walls. Her husband, Patrick, was a dock laborer, a low-spoken man who left early for the Embarcadero and came back with salt on his wrists, accustomed to sacks, crates, and ropes, to work paid by the day or by the week, depending on traffic and a contractor. On that April 18th, he had left before the tremor, saying that the wooden ship that had arrived the night before needed to be unloaded quickly. When the ground began to roll, Ellen woke to the crib creaking and dishes breaking. She got up without thinking, pulled her youngest, Liam, off the mattress, and dragged her daughter Nora by the sleeve. The ceiling cracked. The wardrobe toppled. The cat ran across shards. Outside, in the street, neighbors shouted names, not cries for help, but names, as if calling someone were a way to tie them to the world and keep them from vanishing. The shaking passed, leaving a heavy silence, and soon came the first smell of gas, that acrid odor that spread when pipes ruptured. Ellen saw a tongue of flame appear toward Mission Street, thin and uncertain, and then grow as if it had found food. Patrick was not there. She ran to the corner where they kept papers in a biscuit tin. There were the marriage certificate, a letter from his sister, a rent booklet with the landlord's name, and the receipt for a purchase on credit at the grocer's, amounts written in pencil. She stuffed everything into a bag, along with a portrait of Patrick in a felt hat. When she went back to grab a blanket, she heard the crack of a pole falling. A man ran past saying the water had stopped, the pipes had broken, the fire would have no way to be contained, and the sentence made sense because people were already trying to open hydrants with no pressure, useless buckets, men looking up at the sky as if expecting rain. She took the children along 4th Street, with a stream of people moving away from the south, carrying suitcases and cages, pushing improvised carts, some with mattresses tied down by ropes. Smoke was already in her throat. The sun had not properly risen, and the heat of the fire already made her face burn. In the middle of the crowd, Ellen tried to look at every man who passed, searching for Patrick's brown coat, the way he held a cigarette between 2 fingers. But people were covered in white dust and soot. They looked as if made of the same clay, and many had red eyes from irritation and lack of sleep, as if the whole city had spent the night awake. Near Market Street, a policeman ordered everyone to head west, trying to keep a flow in a place where streets became bottlenecks of people and wreckage. The sound of dynamite blasting, used to bring down buildings and create fire breaks, made the children flinch. The boom was followed by a shower of dust and bits of plaster. Ellen heard a woman say they were shooting looters. She also heard from a man with his arm bandaged that the waterfront was catching fire and that many had been called to help carry things, and that some had been trapped between sheds. The phrase lodged in her head, trapped. It was the way people found not to say died. When they reached the Civic Center, the square was already full. City Hall, its dome damaged, looked like a wounded body, with visible cracks and pieces of masonry on the ground. Improvised tents rose where there had been lawns, and blankets were stretched out like walls. The army had set up field kitchens and distributed thin coffee in mugs, with plain bread and portions of preserved food when there was any. Ellen managed to get a piece of bread for the children and spent the night awake, her ear fixed on the distant roar of the fire, as if it were a train that never arrived and never passed, and with a constant fear that the wind would change and push the blaze toward where they were. The next day, April 19th, she tried to get to the Embarcadero. Streets were blocked by debris, and in many places the pavement was broken, with twisted rails and open holes. At every block there were soldiers with rifles ordering people back, controlling passages, and preventing anyone from approaching areas considered dangerous. Near Howard Street, a wall collapsed with a dry crash, and dust rose like snow. Ellen returned to the camp with her throat raw, with no news. The bag of documents seemed lighter and lighter, as if paper were not enough to hold up a life. It was that afternoon that the relatives appeared. Ellen's sister, May, came by ferry from Oakland with her husband, Thomas, carrying a suitcase and a bundle of food, crossing the bay on a service that ran as best it could amid chaos and conflicting reports. They had heard Ellen was alive from a note pinned to an improvised notice board in the square, with names written in pencil, sheets held by tacks, and bits of string. May's eyes were red from wind and held back crying. They also brought a poorly formed piece of news. Someone on the ferry said that one of the piers near the ferry building had been hit, that there had been a collapse, that many dock workers had been taken to the beach, lined up, covered with canvas. No confirmed names, no identified bodies, only the image of Rose. Ellen did not allow herself to fall apart. There were children watching her, and her sister with trembling hands. The tent they obtained in Golden Gate Park, near the flat area close to 8th Avenue, was a rectangle of canvas that smelled of horse and mildew, like stored material reused. At night, the entire park looked like a new city, with rows of small fires and low voices, and the ground, in many places, turned to mud where water was spilled and trampled. The Pacific wind came in without asking, and the canvas snapped like a sail. Ellen spread blankets on the ground and arranged bodies as if arranging furniture that did not exist. The children in one corner, May and Thomas in the other. There was still an empty space, and that emptiness was Patrick's place, even if no one said it. On the morning of April 20th, a man with a thin beard appeared at the tent entrance, holding a hat in his hands. He had a little girl with him, about 7, dirty face, enormous eyes. He said his name was Walter Klein and that he had lost his wife in the Crushnear market. He did not ask for anything directly. He simply stood there like someone who does not know where to put the weight of his own body. The girl did not speak. Ellen saw skin marked with soot and noticed she was barefoot, her feet darkened and wounded from walking. May looked at Ellen as if to say, "There isn't room." But Ellen had already learned, in 2 days, that the city no longer fit inside itself. She made a short gesture, pointing to the ground. Walter thanked her without a voice. The girl slipped in beside Nora like an animal that finds a safe corner. That same day, orders and rumors began to circulate about relief. Anyone who wanted regular rations and perhaps some emergency money had to register. There would be service tables at points in the park and also at the Presidio, with separate lines and hours that changed as supplies arrived. It would be necessary to prove former address and identity. The word prove sounded like an insult to people who had lost everything but their own bodies. Ellen got in line with the papers in her bag. The sun was brighter, and for the first time since the tremor a patch of blue sky could be seen without thick smoke, but the air still tasted of metal and ash. She washed her face in a bucket and combed her hair with her fingers, as if a minimum appearance could serve as a weapon. Nora took turns holding Liam, and May stayed in the tent with the unknown girl, who came to be called only Clara, because that was the name Walter murmured. The line held people of every language. Ellen heard Italian, Cantonese, Spanish, and the quick English of men in rumpled suits, many with loosened ties and shoes covered in dust. A woman behind her carried a small sewing machine, as if it were a child, shielding it with her body. An old man ahead held an empty cage and repeated that the canary had been left in the apartment. Time there was measured in steps. When Ellen reached the table, she saw a clerk with round glasses, a white shirt already gray, and a thick ledger where names were written down in haste and checked against partial lists. Beside him, a soldier with a bayonet looked over heads, more to keep order than to threaten, but the presence of metal made people speak softly, as if any word could be used against them. The clerk asked for name, former address, occupation of the head of household. Ellen answered in a controlled voice. Ellen O'Rourke, 327, Minna Street, wife of a dock laborer. He asked for proof. She handed over the marriage certificate, already darkened along one edge, and the rent booklet. The man flipped through them, frowned. He said the landlord's name was incomplete, that the address needed confirmation by someone responsible, that without the husband present it would be difficult to release payment in cash. They could give rations, perhaps, but the money would be assessed, subject to review and to lists still being assembled, as if her life had to wait for the pace of an office. Ellen felt blood rise to her face. Money was not a luxury. It was what would buy shoes for Nora and medicine for Liam, who coughed at night, and also what would make it possible to pay for any room when the tents began to be dismantled. She did not ask for pity. She asked for a path. How to prove it? The clerk pointed to a board with instructions, witnesses, employment receipts, any official document. Ellen had a grocery receipt and Patrick's sister's letter. Nothing from the docks. Nothing from the employer. The man said lists of missing workers were being compiled, but it would take time. And Ellen knew, with bitter clarity, that time was exactly what the fire had stolen. She left the table with a stamped ration paper and the feeling of having been pushed out of her own life. Outside, a man offered help for a few cents. He said he knew people in the office who could speed up registrations. Ellen walked past. In 2 days, she had already learned to recognize the face of someone who feeds on disaster. On the way back to camp, she crossed the park where horses pulled carts with water barrels, and water was distributed into cans and buckets, with lines that began before dawn. Children ran between tents, laughing in short moments, as if the body forgot for an instant. Near a field kitchen, 2 women argued in low voices about Chinese people being prevented from receiving aid in certain lines and about people being sent away. Ellen had no energy to be outraged as before. The city seemed to have become a set of improvised rules, and whoever did not fit was left at the edge, invisible for lack of the right paper. In the tent, May tried to divide a piece of salted meat among 6 people. Walter Klein had returned with a can of condensed milk someone had given him. Clara ate without lifting her eyes. Thomas, May's husband, had gone looking for work with any cleanup crew and came back empty-handed and with dust in his hair, saying there were more arms than tools. Night fell cold, and the sound of the wind seemed louder because the city, without whole buildings, let the air run free, crossing the park as if there were nothing left to hold it. On April 22nd, Sunday, Ellen decided to return to the notice board at the Civic Center. There were hundreds of notes, some in neat handwriting, others in hurried scrawls, pinned to boards and temporary walls. Seeking mother, seeking son, last seen on 3rd Street, at the Ferry Building. Ellen pinned Patrick's name in a corner, with the description of the brown coat and the small scar on his chin. Beside it, someone had posted a list of bodies collected in a certain area, and the words unidentified repeated like hammer blows, alongside dates and approximate locations, as if the city were trying to arrange the irreparable into columns. On the way back, she passed near a fenced area where men unloaded simple coffins. There was no ceremony, only work, raw wood, nails, the quick movements of those trying to avoid contagion and decomposition. A priest hurried by, murmuring words into the air. Ellen did not approach. She understood there were things that, seen up close, would become too final, and at that moment she still needed some margin to keep walking. The second week began with the city trying to organize itself into relief districts. On April 25th, Ellen heard that a temporary office was accepting property declarations near Fillmore Street, in a building still standing, with tables set up in rooms full of dust and people. They said that with a signed declaration and witnesses, it might be possible to receive a rent voucher or a small sum. Ellen gathered her papers and went early, leaving May with the children and with Clara, as if the camp were a house and she were only going out to settle a matter, not crossing a broken city. This line was different, harsher. There were men with folders, women with family brooches pinned to already worn dresses, all trying to prove not only that they existed, but that they owned, and the word ownership seemed to separate those with some backing from those who had always lived on rent and wages. The clerk at this table was more impatient. He asked for title, deed, registration. Ellen said she did not own a house, only a rental. The man looked as if that diminished her. He said that for a rental, she would need proof from the landlord or a recent receipt. Ellen showed the booklet. He said it could be forged. The word struck her like a hand, because it did not attack only the paper. It attacked the entire life that paper was trying to represent. It was there that her morale nearly broke, not from physical exhaustion, but from the idea that everything she had been could be denied by someone with a stamp. Ellen breathed and, instead of arguing, asked to speak with someone who knew the Minna Street area. An older woman, a volunteer with a badge pinned on, listened to the story and asked whether there were neighbors who could testify. Ellen remembered Mrs. Donahue, the downstairs neighbor who sold pies and had a loud laugh. She also remembered Mr. Kim, who had a laundry on the corner and always greeted Patrick with a nod. But where were they now? Perhaps in some tent miles away, perhaps in Oakland, perhaps under rubble. The city had scattered people like ash. The volunteers said there was a way. Ellen could fill out a simple sworn statement and obtain 2 witness signatures in the camp, people who would confirm they had seen the family at that address before the disaster. It did not have to be the landlord. It had to be people who would risk their own names for her. Ellen felt shame rise like heat in her ears. To ask, that was to ask others to commit themselves at a time when commitment was a scarce resource and when each signature could become a problem. Back at camp, she explained to May and Thomas. May signed without hesitation, and Thomas did too, though he said, with tired eyes, that his name was worth little to the men in the office. Ellen looked for someone else. Walter Klein had known the family only after the earthquake, so he did not count. Ellen walked between tents, asking for Mrs. Donahue. She asked for people from Minna Street. No one knew. Some looked away, as if the request were a danger. One man said he would sign for a coin. Ellen left without answering, because paying for a truth was the same as accepting it was worth nothing. Late in the afternoon, she found a familiar face near a soup line. Mr. Kim, short beard, hands red from cold, tired eyes. He had a cut on his forehead and carried a cloth sack of clothes, like someone who saved what would fit. Ellen called to him carefully, as if she might startle him and lose that chance. He recognized her, and the recognition was a small shelter in the middle of improvisation. She explained the need for the signature. He listened in silence. Around them, the camp made the noise of stubborn life. Pots, footsteps, coughing, children. Mr. Kim looked at Nora and Liam, looked at Clara, who stayed near the tent like a shadow. Then he nodded. He took the pencil firmly and wrote his name in careful letters, as if each stroke carried legal weight, and as if he knew that, in that moment, what was at stake was not only a voucher, but Ellen's ability to keep a roof. On April 27th, Ellen returned to the office with the declaration. The volunteer helped place it in the right spot, and the clerk stamped it with a quick motion. He said she would receive a voucher for extra provisions and, possibly, a small payment when the lists were reviewed. It was not the certainty she needed, but it was an opening. Ellen left with the paper folded inside her dress, close to her chest, as if it were a talisman, not out of superstition, but because the body needed to feel it would not be torn from her by a shove. The opening did not remain intact. That same week, they began redistributing people to different camps. There were too many in Golden Gate Park, they said, and families had to be moved to the Presidio and to areas farther south. Orders came from men with clipboards and were carried out by soldiers, with schedules and instructions that changed according to pressure and space. Ellen saw tents being dismantled without gentleness. She saw a woman scream because they wanted to separate her from her brother because they were not immediate family under some rule. She saw Walter Klein nearly sent away with Clara for lacking formal registration. And suddenly what had seemed temporary took on the weight of a decision. Stay together or be separated by a line on a form. It was in this tightening of rules that Ellen made a decision that would change the rest of her life, not out of grand courage, but out of small necessity. She went to the camp registration table and declared Walter and Clara as relatives under temporary care. The phrase was awkward, but it was what the volunteer suggested, something that would allow them to remain in the same tent and receive rations together. Ellen signed the paper with a sweaty hand, feeling the risk. If she were accused of fraud, she could lose the little she had won. But separating Clara from a known patch of ground, after so many days, seemed more cruel than any abstract threat, and Ellen had already learned that cruelty could also come in the name of order. The consequence came quickly and irreversibly, the way things happen when the world is unstable. On May 3rd, 1906, a messenger from the office compiling the lists of the dead appeared in the camp, carrying a stack of papers. They called names out loud, and people approached as if they were receiving a letter. Ellen heard O'Rourke, and her stomach dropped. She walked to the table, feeling the cold wind cut her skin. The man asked if she was the wife of Patrick O'Rourke, dock worker. Ellen nodded, and he handed her a short form, identified among the deceased, with an approximate location and a date, April 20th, when bodies were collected near a burned shed on the Embarcadero. There was no body to view, they said, because many had been buried quickly for sanitary reasons, in trenches and cemeteries under pressure of time and heat. The paper stated that she could, later, request additional confirmation. Even death, there, came with the word later. There was no fainting scene. Ellen stood still, holding the form as if it were a hot object. May appeared beside her, read over her shoulder, and her hand gripped Ellen's arm hard, as if that could keep the paper from becoming true. Nora, 10 years old, had already learned to read expressions. She understood before hearing any explanation and went quiet, eyes fixed on the ground. Liam kept playing with a bottle cap, not understanding the size of what had happened, and that difference between what a child understands and what an adult must swallow made everything heavier. Patrick's death, formalized on paper, was not only grief. It was a change of status that shifted everything. Ellen's declaration about Walter and Clara now seemed even more dangerous, because a widow with extra dependents could be seen as an opportunist. At the same time, the death paper was, paradoxically, proof she would need for any future request. The city demanded documents to recognize pain, and Ellen realized that even mourning had to be presented in an acceptable format. That night, inside the tent, the camp seemed quieter, though the park was full of sounds. Ellen folded the form and placed it with the other papers in the bag. Then, with a motion that was neither ritual nor comfort, only organization, she took Patrick's portrait and stood it upright, propped against a box. The photograph had a dark stain along one edge, as if the fire had tried to touch it and given up. Walter Klein looked at the image and lowered his head. Clara, without knowing, touched the paper with a finger and then curled her cold feet back under the blanket, as if her body only knew how to respond to cold and hunger, not to what adults called fate. In the days that followed, Ellen began to live by a logic of small tasks that kept life upright. She woke before the sun, when the canvas was still damp with dew, and went to fetch water in a line that began early, with buckets and cans marked so they would not be lost. She washed the children's hands carefully, because disease prowled the camps, where improvised latrines and crowding made any fever a threat. On May 7th, a volunteer doctor came through examining children with coughs. Ellen held Liam on her lap, and the doctor said he needed to be kept warm and away from smoke, as if that were a choice. She obtained a little simple syrup at the supply tent and kept it as if it were gold, because there the value of things had changed. What had once been common was now rare, and the rare could decide a night. With the death paper, Ellen returned to the office on May 10th, on a morning of strong wind that carried dust from what had once been entire blocks. The volunteer recognized her and helped her fill out a request for additional aid for widows. The clerk, the same one with round glasses, looked at the death form and, for the first time, treated Ellen without that hard doubt, as if the stamp finally authorized compassion. He stamped another paper, authorizing more rations and a small weekly sum for a limited time, subject to review as rules stabilized. It was not a dock wage, but it was ground, and Ellen learned to measure hope by things that fit in the hand. The sum came in heavy coins delivered in a small cloth pouch. Ellen counted them one by one, not out of distrust, but because counting was a way to believe it existed and was not only a promise. With that money, she bought used shoes for Nora from an improvised seller near Haight Street, where someone had set up a stand with donated clothing and recovered pieces. She also bought a bar of soap and a piece of cloth to mend Liam's clothes. Each purchase carried the weight of a decision. There was no surplus, and there were still more mouths than planned, more needs than coins. Walter Klein, for his part, found work with a crew clearing rubble near Post Street. He left in the morning and returned with aching arms and dust in his eyelashes, his body marked by carrying boards and bricks and by breathing harsh air all day. He handed over part of what he earned for food, not as rent, but as belonging, as if the gesture were the only way not to be merely a man tolerated in a tent. Clara began to speak a few quiet words with Nora, and the two of them started gathering pieces of dry wood for the common fire. The space inside the tent remained tight. Bodies slept in calculated positions, like pieces of a puzzle. Sometimes Ellen woke with the feeling there was not enough air and went out into the park's cold, where the moon lit rows of canvas and the dark silhouettes of eucalyptus trees, and the distant sound of hammers and carts reminded her that the city did not sleep. It only changed tasks. In June, when the city began to raise temporary wooden structures, the so-called earthquake cottages, relief officials announced that some families could apply for one of these units. They were small, with simple roofs, built on vacant lots, with new boards and exposed nails, meant to ease pressure on the camps. Ellen put her name on the list. Proof of widowhood and the registrations helped. But there were many Ellens in the city, many with papers and children and losses, and the line, even when not visible, continued to exist in the form of waiting. The irreversible, she discovered, was not only Patrick's death. It was also the way life had rearranged itself around that absence. The home on Minna Street no longer existed. Even if it did, the rent would never be the same, and the old blocks had become maps of ash and rebuilding. The routine of waiting for her husband with the smell of the docks would never return. And in its place, there was now a family enlarged by accident, held up by signatures and stamps, and by a kind of silent agreement among strangers who had learned, out of necessity, to share what remained. At the end of July 1906, on a clear morning when the wind came more gently off the ocean, Ellen received word that a small wooden house was available for her and the children in an area near the park, close to 23rd Avenue. It was not ownership. It was a temporary allotment, a chance to leave canvas behind, with occupancy rules and occasional inspections. Ellen walked to the site with May and the children. The little house had a door that closed, small windows, and the smell of new pine. Inside, there was room for 2 narrow beds and a table. The floor was rough boards. To Ellen, it felt like a quiet luxury, a place where rain would not come through seams, where the wind would not decide the night. The move required final decisions. May and Thomas decided to return to Oakland, where Thomas had secured a promise of work in a warehouse. They hugged Ellen hard at the cottage door, like people who do not know when they will see each other again. May left an embroidered handkerchief and a packet of flour. Ellen watched the two of them walk away along the dirt road, between other identical cottages, until they became only small figures in the sun, and she understood that rebuilding was also this, separating, reorganizing, accepting distances. Walter and Clara could not stay there forever either. Relief would not allow so many names under the same roof. Walter had found a distant relative in Alameda who could take them in. On the last night before they left, Clara slept beside Nora, as always. In the morning, Walter packed the few things into a bag. Ellen helped fasten the girl's coat. There were no grand promises. Walter thanked her in a simple way, eyes on the ground, and said what Ellen had done had kept Clara alive. Ellen only nodded, because there were no words that would not sound excessive. Clara, when it was time to go, touched Patrick's portrait on the table as if she already knew him, and then took Walter's hand. They walked away, and the sound of their steps was swallowed by the noise of a city beginning again, with saws, hammers, and carts, as if work were the only common language. In autumn, the days grew shorter and the nights colder. Ellen found work washing clothes for men working on reconstruction near a street that still smelled of cut wood and lime, with basins, soap, and water heated as best it could be, and pay counted out in coins. Nora began attending an improvised school in a church that had survived, where children wrote on slates and learned not to startle at the sound of hammers. Liam gradually stopped coughing as the air grew less heavy with smoke and more with ordinary dust, and Ellen realized that even the city's breathing was changing phases. On April 18th, 1907, a year later, Ellen went to a point where she could see part of what had been South of Market. New buildings were rising, steel frames, and streets were being leveled. Nothing resembled Minna Street as she had known it. Ellen carried the bag of documents, now more organized, and inside it the death paper folded so many times it seemed like cloth. She did not go looking for the exact place where her husband's body might be. The city had buried those details under layers of necessity. Instead, she returned to the little house, lit the small stove, and made a simple stew. Nora helped cut vegetables. Liam set the table carefully, as if arranging plates were an important gesture, as if domestic order were a way to keep the world in place. That night, when the wind blew in from the Pacific and made the windows vibrate slightly, Ellen took Patrick's portrait and wiped the frame with the edge of her apron. She put the photograph back in its place, not as an altar, but as part of the furnishings, a quiet presence in a house that had learned to exist in another way. The canvas of Golden Gate Park, the lines on Van Ness, the signatures asked for in shame, the name called on a list. Everything was kept not as a grand story, but as the exact sequence of days in which a woman held up a roof with papers in hands. Outside, the city continued to grow, noisy and practical. And inside that small wooden house the silence was not empty. It was simply the space left to remember clearly and to go on with what was possible. A plate served, a bed made, a door closed against the wind. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like the video. It helps these often forgotten stories find the audience they deserve. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you as well. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. This community stretches across places, generations, and personal histories, brought together by a shared respect for the past. Thank you for being here. And thank you for helping keep these stories alive.